our Firestorm Crisis Coach webinar for the New Jersey Manufacturing Exchange Program. Welcome to Natural Disasters in Your Organization. We're going to talk about planning for preparedness today. We have a special treat in that we have Jim Satterfield joining us today. We're going to do a little Q&A with Jim and Joe. I'd like your input as well. So thanks everyone for joining. If you'd like to follow along and ask questions, you can use the hashtag Crisis Coach on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And at Twitter, we are Firestorm Soul, and on Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. So please do connect with us. On LinkedIn, too. Firestorm, as you know, transforms crisis into value, and we empower you to manage your risk and crises. Our expertise is in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We are your crisis coach. As you know, this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. Any work product that is provided by Firestorm should be read in conjunction with any national, regional, and local authorities, as well as your company's personal counsel. Moreover, the information given and comments made in this webinar should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're very pleased to have Joe Caradenuto with us today from the NJMEP. Joe, would you like to chat a little bit about the NJMEP, any programs you have coming up, and anything else you'd like our audience to know?
Sure. For those that are not familiar, New Jersey Manufacturing Extension Program, our mission is to work with manufacturers in the state to help them become more productive, more efficient, and more globally competitive. And we do it through a variety of different services that we provide, and those include things like assistance with energy and helping companies get R&D tax credits. We do a lot with process improvement, Lean, and Six Sigma, in addition to helping companies on the growth side with strategic planning, innovation and growth services. And of course, we deal very heavily in compliance, and with many of the standards changing this year, we're helping companies get upgraded to the new 2015 ISO standard, as well as those for aerospace and for medical device that are also changing. And one of the biggest ones is the food industry that's changing radically with a lot of new requirements for food manufacturers to now be in line with. So this all brings us to business continuity planning, which is part of the risk assessment, which is included in many of these new standards. So we'll be interested to hear what you have to say, Karen, today.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe. And I'd like to remind everybody who is on this call today, and if you're joining as a group, maybe a team around a conference table, that because of the gracious cooperation and partnership we've developed with the New Jersey Manufacturing Exchange Program, you do have the opportunity to reach out to Firestorm for a fee-waived sort of a self-guided assessment. It's a very high-level assessment that we can help you with, and we thank you, Joe, and your organization for making that possible. I'd like to introduce Jim Satterfield. Say hello, Jim.
Good morning.
Jim Satterfield is the Chief Executive Officer of Firestorm and a co-founder, and he is my mentor when it comes to handling crises and disaster. And as I was putting this webinar together this month, I thought, you know, I'd really like to have sort of a Q&A back and forth with Jim on some high-level areas that I know became a concern to me when I relocated to a coastal state, and the weather I was used to changed, and the risks I was used to changed. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. Now, last month we discussed what keeps you up at night. We talked about the various events that could occur on your property, in your buildings, with your employees, with your customers, with your suppliers, to interrupt your business a brand damage event. We talked about hacking, and all of these subjects are being covered as the year progresses. And the one thing that we ended on was natural disaster. What happens when a natural disaster occurs? And for most of you, when we surveyed you as to your primary concerns, that what would a number one crisis be, so many of you said a natural disaster devastation. And Jim, you had some observations on this pie chart. Would you like to chime in a little bit about what your observations were?
Well, be glad to, and you're doing a great job, so perhaps I just can sit here and be quiet for the conversation today. If you look at that, 1 in 4 of, and this was a survey, and I think, Karen, it was 800 or 900 people that had given us these answers. So 1 in 4 of you, natural disasters, and came into play. And when we think about that, that's what we see on the news. The fires that are burning down where I am today. I'm down on the coast of Georgia at St. Simon's Island, but the fire that's occurring here just south of us in the Okefenokee Swamp, it was started by a lightning strike. But yet now it's disrupting businesses, closing schools, blocking highways, loss of homes. It's a material event, and whether it's the hurricane, the flood, the tornado, the earthquake, we see those areas. Now, if you look on the diagram that's there in front of you, the pie chart, you look at loss of life as one of the other big concerns. Well, many times in a natural disaster, it's what we see. The Red Cross states that there are 20,000 disasters annually in the U.S. The majority of those are fires. More people die from drowning than any other single source. So you add that 6 to the 24, and you're suddenly saying, wait, that's a significant component. And Karen pointed out in the conversation we were having the other day that really if you go to the left of that natural disaster list in the pie chart, you look at the significant reputation event. How you respond here will determine how your organization is viewed in a natural disaster. What did you do to prevent, to mitigate? How did you respond? How did you support the people that were involved? If I were to say United Airlines today, everybody would have the mental picture of the doctor being dragged down the aisle. That's showing you how an event in a decision can have an impact that goes far beyond what was originally intended. And that's why this becomes such a significant component for us to talk about. So as we look at this, you're not in control of everything that's going on. And that is going to have that level of impact. Back to you, Karen.
Well, that's a great segue into talking about the impact. Let's think about that impact and the impact that natural disasters have on organizations just like those on this call today. And last month and the month before, we asked the most important question, and that is, could you handle it? Have you explored your ability to respond with your teams? Have you identified your strengths and weaknesses and shored those up? And you are all on a northeast coast, or the majority of you, that has experienced some pretty significant weather patterns over the past few years in ways that we hadn't really anticipated in the past. And what we're looking at right now is a picture of Joplin, Missouri. I go back to that quite often because it was such a devastating event. The Moore, Oklahoma, Hurricane Sandy. I mean, these are things that we know were significant events that created such an impact because it was more than the terrible and sad loss of life, but it was the loss of infrastructure to support the community that really had the most impact. The hospital was absolutely destroyed. Schools were destroyed, and businesses were destroyed. So people had nowhere to get help. They had nowhere to go to work to earn money to rebuild. There were programs in place, and those take a long time to work through. So we want to make sure that you, as manufacturers and as members of your community, with the support of organizations such as the NJMEP, have well-designed and executed plans to enable you to outperform your competitors and show resiliency, because that's a brand attribute, and also fulfill the expectations of your stakeholders, your clients, your customers, your vendors, and others who interact with your organization. And because of that, or to help you with that, Jim Satterfield said, you know, I think what we do is we predict, we plan, and then we perform. So Jim, do you want to talk about how you created that methodology for people to respond to crisis and disaster?
When we think about those words, predict, plan, perform, the methodology becomes extremely critical. In a crisis and a disaster, everybody wants to immediately jump to perform. And mistakes are made, things are overlooked, and you don't have what you need. If you go back to predict, you focus on what could occur, what's its impact, how do we monitor for that, and what are the triggers to activate our plans. Now, natural disasters, in many cases, we do a better job predicting than other types of things. If we're talking about workplace violence, then we're dealing with behaviors of concern as an indicator. But here, if it's a weather-related event, we can have those reports and we can know about what's happening and we understand the weather patterns. But even some of these natural disasters may not come with that knowledge if you're looking at an event like an earthquake. And if we have people today on the call out of California, obviously you don't have those warning signs. But if you predicted that it was going to occur, you understood the impacts, then you can start to better make your plan. So the plan is, what do you want to do in the moment, the emergency response? How do you make decisions, the crisis management plan? And then finally, how do we restore our operations? That's where our continuity plans would come into play. So first is predict, then is plan. Now then the perform becomes, how do we train people? How do we test our plans if they're going to work? And a quick test to think about in your plan is describe an event, hand your plan to your newest employee and say, look in the plan and tell me what it is that you would do. If they can't answer that, then your plan won't work at the time you need it the most. I was just on the phone prior to this, and the group that we were talking with immediately recognized that their plans tell them what to do, but not how to do it, and therefore they were unexecutable. The time to figure that out is now, not in the heat of the event that's starting to occur. So, Karen, I think this gives a framework for everyone to look and analyze their plans.
I agree, Jim. I remember the first time when I joined Firestorm and I saw this, it made a great deal of sense to me, and it still does, certainly to this day. And I think, too, one of the things that you've taught me is that the crisis or disaster is never going to unfold exactly the way you practice or plan. There may be some outlier side of it or event of it that you had not anticipated, but it's not the actual plan, it's the planning, it's the exercise, it's the brain memory of teaching your brain how to respond in a crisis that really makes the difference, isn't it? And so I just hope that people really sit down once a week and expand what those types of events they're planning for are. Because we plan for the big ones. You know, we get our teams together and we say, okay, we're going to plan for a cyber event, or we're going to plan for a hurricane. But there are the nuances of events in between, Jim. I don't know if we still use the term black swan anymore, but those are things that are really critical to the disaster readiness and ultimate value of your company, correct?
Yeah, and the list that you have up on the screen gives you a good frame of reference of where to start and the types of things that you need to have in place. And by the way, as with every Firestorm webinar, there will be a brief afterwards that'll be available in the next couple of days off our website. So you don't have to worry about scrambling to try to write down the things that you see on the screen. But as you look at this, this is where it needs to come together. There has to be this culture within the organization. If you don't have this in place, It's like deferred maintenance. If you don't change the oil in your car, eventually that car is not going to go anywhere. And if you don't update and change and create this environment within your organization, you're going to find that you have a significant disruption. There are three things to focus on: loss of your facility, loss of your people, and loss of your information and data. And so your plan needs to very simply address those priorities. And what you do in the emergency, the incident management is how you make the decisions in responding there and going. Every plan is written to a particular area. And as Karen has put up the points to consider here, you hear the term all hazards approach, and that means you're looking at all the events that would happen, and normally that focuses heavily on natural disasters and looking at what is the impact, what's the onset, what's the warning that you're going to have, the significance on the financially, on the facility, on the people, prioritizing those, and then going back to that predict, what are the indicators, and then what are the triggers to activate those plans. Putting this in place, updating it annually, so you can tweak it this year and next year, but once every 3 years, you need to go back and do this from the very beginning all the way through.
Jim, those are great points, and it leads me into our next area. I was just thinking, in every job that I'd ever worked or every role that I've ever had in any company prior to joining Firestorm, I was never trained in any kind of procedure that had to do with a crisis or disaster. And I've worked for pretty large companies. Maybe I was just always with a group that got forgotten. So one of the most important things that we talk about is you must involve everyone, whether you have 5 employees or 50,000 employees. They must be trained. And failure to train is one of the top 5 or common failures in a crisis that Firestorm has identified, right?
Yeah, and quickly, those 5 failures, because they're worth mentioning here, and then we'll specifically come back to the word train. The first is supply chain failure, and since we're talking to manufacturers, that certainly resonates because the disaster doesn't necessarily have to happen to you. It could happen to one of your key critical suppliers. If you can't get the materials you need, you're not going to be able to do what you're focused on doing. The second is the failure to train employees for work and at home, and the statistics are 70% of your employees don't know what to do in a disaster or a crisis. The third is to identify and monitor all threats and risks. We find in many cases threats have been identified, but there's no monitoring to see if they're imminent or about to occur. The fourth is the failure to test and update your plans. And the last is the failure to have a crisis communications plan. The visual on the screen is an overwhelmingly compelling one. That blue line is the path the tornado took. If your child was in the Plaza Towers Elementary School and you knew this going, you're going to do everything you can to get to that location. Until you see your child, you're not going to know that that's okay. As you look at these events, and then underneath the grayed out area where it says failure to train, you can see that the medical facility was there. That hospital was taken out. So now the very place you've got to take people to, that's off the table. This affects an area. We dealt with an account that was in Tuscaloosa. They were in the roofing business, and their business was destroyed by tornadoes that hit Tuscaloosa. They rebuilt in Joplin, and then their plant was destroyed there. I asked the owner of the company, tell us where you're going next, because we want to tell everybody to move out of the way. This can happen wherever you are. And so planning for it is a critical portion of what you do. Karen?
And, you know, Jim, this makes me think of the situation that occurred in West Virginia where it wasn't a natural disaster that affected the environment, but it was a chemical producing company, factory, that had a unattended to leak that literally poisoned the water for about 220,000 people. It was the water source. And because of that, all of the other manufacturing facilities in the area were ordered to cease and desist because they used that water in their manufacturing processes. And it created significant impact on the community that's being felt to this day. Those manufacturers who couldn't continue to produce for a period of some of them up to a month or more. I mean, everybody on this call needs to think about what would you do with your employees if you had to tell them for a month or more they were not going to be able to come to work? Would they still be there when the crisis was over? Could you work or figure out alternate ways to get product to your customers? It was a really nightmare situation. In addition, of course, hospitals and others had to ship in water because they couldn't use the contaminated water in their operations. Restaurants had to close because if you don't have running water, you're not allowed to open the doors. So the impacts are far and wide, and training is a critical point for all of the employees in your organization, but also those who are on your property. I think sometimes we forget that we have vendors who are on our property in and out, or some of them in a more semi-permanent basis all of the time. We have visitors who come to our property. We need to know where they are and what they're doing. We have neighbors, and so everybody should be involved in the training process, and especially the folks within our organization. And Jim, please talk about It's More Than a Book on a Shelf.
Well, if you have a three-ring binder and no one ever looks at it, it's not going to do you any good. In fact, today, putting your plans in the palm of your employees' hands on their smartphones is certainly the new industry standard in doing that. And so if people need to have plans that are actionable, that tell them what to do, but it needs to be where they are and putting that in place. If you're doing an exercise and the executives remain in their office and don't participate, then it's also sending a message to your staff that that's not an element that they can do. So looking at all of these things, it's when you think about any of these things, it's the decisions that you make, it's the actions that you take, and it's the words that you say that will make a difference in terms of what happens in each of those areas. So only by training, only by testing are you going to see this come together. Karen?
You know, Jim, one of the things that I'll tell everyone, a very personal thing on this call is I had just a personal crisis in my family, not with me, but a health issue with a family member. And Jim was outstanding as my crisis manager. He helped me with really critical decisions because I wasn't in a position to be able to make them myself. And I remember thinking, gosh, this guy should be a crisis manager because he is really able to stand back and objectively talk to you about what critical decisions need to be made and in what order in order to keep you focused and on track. And that's the gift of, I think, everyone at Firestorm. They have that ability to communicate and lead down your path that's right for you. Now, when we talk about communication, I do want to mention something. We mentioned this briefly on the call last month, and I just want to talk about it again. Last month, a hacker was able to hack into the Dallas emergency weather siren warning system, and for 2.5 hours, I believe it was, set off every siren in the Dallas area, and really frightened so many people. There was panic in organizations. Imagine right now if your sirens went off, and there would be people clamoring to your office, your phone would be ringing, your phone would be blowing up, people saying what's going on, and you don't have any answers. Well, the thing is, if you can hack into a system to turn everything on, is it possible to hack into a system to turn it off? And so we're living in a world where change is a constant in our world, but we're living in a world where the ways in which we can be attacked or hurt or damage done is far more sophisticated and harder to identify than it has been in the past. So I use this as an example of how do you test whether your communications work. Jim, what are your thoughts in this area?
Well, obviously, it'd be terrifying if there was actually tornadoes and the city was unable to alert anyone to it. But how do the alerts go out within your company? Or do you use catchphrases like we're having a code red, or we're using a term? We worked with a church and their statement was, and they had someone on the property that had a violent intent, that the florist was in the sanctuary. Well, who can understand what that really means? Having clear, crisp communications already designed so that you can update them if you need to, because it's easier to edit than to create. But what are you going to say if we have this event? What are you going to say if we have that event? What actions do you want people to take? Because the choices are shelter in place, lockout, lockdown, and evacuate. Shelter in place is normally used for a weather or a natural disaster related event. A lockout is if there's a threat outside of the building that has a violent intent and you're trying to keep the problem out. A lockdown is the violent event is occurring within your property. And then finally evacuate. The structure itself is not safe, or our people are in an area that can get away from where the problem would be. Understanding those things become very important. The first communications in a crisis event or a natural disaster event is the one of coordination, and that's what we've been talking about. The second types of communication go back to brand, and those would come in another wave, and that's where you see the messages from Virginia Tech, that they would not be defined by the event, that they would invent the future, that they would embrace the families. And the last set of communications that you would give would be compliance. That would apply in a cyber breach or an identity theft area. There are certain compliance requirements that you would have to put into place. And so those are what we're focused on in looking at each step along the way. Karen?
Jim, as you were talking, I'm thinking too of the point that Firestorm makes all the time, is that family trumps work. And in the case of an isolated incident to your facility or your location, if a power line comes down in front of your building, that's something that can be repaired and fixed, and you're back home with your family and everything is fine that evening. But in the case of a natural disaster, as Jim mentioned with the pictures we saw from the Moore tornado area, your first instinct is to get in your car and go see if your family's okay. And if you're not able to do that, if you suddenly have in your facility, I don't know if you have 5 people or 250 people, and those people can't leave the facility, whether it be because of flooding, a road where roads into your area are out. They're not allowed to leave the building because of a chemical or some other sort of, maybe a train has derailed and they can't go outside. How are you going to manage that situation? And do you have plans, and have you walked through what that scenario will look like if that continues on for longer than a few hours? Jim, you've done plans for folks that may have to keep employees housed and fed for a week or more. Isn't that true?
Well, particularly if you look at things like an earthquake in those areas where that's going to be an extended stay, if there is a significant event that occurs, those are going to be considerations. Most people are going to want to find a way to get home to their family. Right now in Atlanta, we've had a major disruption. Most of you will remember the news about the highway burning up, which is certainly not what one would normally think about a steel and concrete structure. And it cut off how 250,000 people transversed coming from their home into their company location. This was a man-made event that was done as opposed to a natural disaster, but it could have just as easily have been. So thinking about how do we do this, how do we help, how do we communicate is going to be that. And you look at the last thing about a hotline or Facebook, those types of disruptions. And Karen, go on and show the road that was down near you. I think that's a good example of what you're talking about. And nobody's going home on that road today. And look at that disaster. And that happened down where you live, I believe, didn't it?
Yes, we had, those of us along the lower East Coast had a a 1,000-year flood event because of Hurricane Matthew and some other weather systems that just sat on top of us. And Jim, you know what? The one thing I was thinking about with we actually used you as an example last month with the great burning of one of the main routes in Atlanta and your highway. But what happened afterward was even more interesting in that the alternate route that everyone was taking, I think it was 20, is that right?
Right.
It buckled. And
there was a gas line that caused it to buckle, and so you start, it's like, imagine a heart attack. If you start cutting the flow of blood to your heart, on an artery, and then the other artery goes, the patient may not survive. And the disruption to businesses that occurred as a result of this, to governments, to other organizations, were extremely material. And we don't want to be doomsday sayers here. We're not trying to talk about that. But what would you do? How would you run your business if your employees physically couldn't come to work? If we're a manufacturing facility, which we're working today with the New Jersey MEP on this webinar, think about that loss. And so you need to start to say, how can we handle those operations? And you see a little table down there. What's the staff we need on day 1 and day 2 and day 7? What can we do and how will we do it? Which orders are going to be impacted? What about work in progress? All of those manufacturing elements are going to start to come in. And remember, everything we're saying about this not only is your company, but your critical suppliers. So you're saying, well, gee, Jim, I'm not here. I'm not going to have that. But if you have a critical supplier and they're in LA and there's an earthquake, you're not going to get a shipment from that. If the ports are closed in LA, you're not going to be getting a shipment coming out from that. So looking at those things and piecing this together and thinking about that and how we're going to operate will make a significant difference. Karen?
You know, Jim, this also goes back to what we talked about as we started the session, and that is that brand and reputation can be an ancillary crisis as a result of how you handle the disaster. During Hurricane Sandy, shortly thereafter, Madison Square Garden put out a notice that I can't remember the exact wording, so I'm going to get it wrong and paraphrase a little bit here, but basically it said, if you don't come into work, you won't have a job. And I don't know if they were planning on sending boats to people's houses, but people couldn't physically get to work. They had to have some alternate plan for how they were going to assist employees. And so they received tremendous backlash from customers and from businesses in the area that support their events, from basketball teams to musicians to other performances that were scheduled. So I think we really have to give thought to more than just, oh my God, we might not be able to operate for a couple of days. I think it can have much deeper and longer impacts, and certainly to your brand and reputation, and that's what we want to talk about. And Jim, when you first saw this image, this image is from my neighborhood. This is just around the corner, and this was after Hurricane Matthew. The ground was fairly wet, and we have live oaks all throughout. I live in Charleston, South Carolina. And so when the high winds started, and they weren't even that severe, we had trees come down, and it wasn't so much, some folks had damage to their homes, and the biggest impact was that we couldn't get anywhere because the trees were blocking the roads. And then the flooding events started. And we are fortunate by a foot. People just a mile from us who are just a foot lower than we are flooded 6 feet into their homes. And so people were flooded. They couldn't get anywhere. And then the rivers started to recede back to the ocean. And when the rivers started to recede back to the ocean, they overflowed their banks and created a secondary flooding crisis. We had roads wash out completely. So even if you could clear the trees away to try to get somewhere, we had roads that had completely fallen apart and flooded out. And it was not a major hurricane. So we really have to think through how we're going to help our employees be prepared in case of a crisis, and then come up with some alternate ways that they can perform their jobs. Jim, I'm very fortunate that I am a remote employee for Firestorm, as are some others here in the Charleston area, and we were able to keep working. But that's not true for all organizations. So one of the things that Firestorm teaches us is we are our own first responder. True?
Yep, and I want to come back and leave it on the slide, but the previous one with that major limb over the house and the car, everybody on the phone and in the webinar today should immediately think, is this employee coming to work today? And the answer is going to be no. They're going to be concerned about it because, as Karen said, family trumps job. So as we talk about these crises, let's get away from the abstract and get back to the specific, that every crisis is a human crisis. You're going to be focused on that, and every one of your employees will be focused on that. So as you're planning for these events, need to think about it. Having a generator at home so an employee not can necessarily work, but that their family's going to be okay and deal with those types of areas. If we take a power away, if electricity is not available, and that happens with ice storms, snowstorms, thunder showers, and heavy winds, tornadoes, hurricanes, loss of power is an expected one. And the good news is most of the utilities in the areas we have are trained and will get those back up as quickly as they can. But if you take electricity away, you have a time machine, and now you've moved back in time 150 years. How many of us have gone into a room when there's a power outage and still flip the wall switch and go, oh, the power's out, the light's not coming on? I've done that. Go ahead, Karen.
No, I was just saying I did that. I did that the entire time. We were without power for about 5 days, and I just constantly did that.
And so as you look at it, getting that power, recharging that cell phone, whether it's a hand crank or another, that may be your lifeline here. Having a battery-powered radio, let's go back to at least get the updates and reports of what's coming in. How are we going to get this information? Because you'll be amazed at how quickly that phone's going to lose power, how quickly your lifeline is going to go away associated with it. So you should be thinking power not only at your facility. Blair, who's normally on our calls today and works as a Firestorm principal supporting the New Jersey MEP, is doing an interview with a pharmaceutical company, and that we're working with them on a business continuity program. And they grow certain things in their labs, and if they lost power, they would lose all of that product. And so thinking about this impact is something should be high on your list of priorities. Karen?
Oh, those are great points, Jim. I think every manufacturer especially has to look at their processes and what's involved and how they would be impacted. And just, again, there's going to be a brief of this session. Once we capture Jim's comments, we incorporate it into a brief. So this page that has some points to consider specifically for your employees or on a more individual basis is a really good checklist. And the number one thing is flooding. And in almost every major crisis or disaster weather event, we see that flooding, unless they're wildfires, becomes a significant issue. So when we have these sorts of things occur, the biggest question is who's paying for it? And what do we do next? And how do we know about insurance? This image that you're seeing was a couple of days after the hurricane hit here, and it was when the crews started coming in and moving the trees off to the side of the road. This is a tree that was blocking a major path for us, and it was a huge limb, not the whole tree, just a limb, and or a side of the tree. So, Jim, what do we do next How do we know what our insurance is going to cover?
All right. For everyone on the call, if you're doing tests and drills with your group or a tabletop exercise, take that exercise, take your vulnerability hazard matrix that you've created and hand it to your insurance broker and ask them, how would we be covered if this were to happen? You want to know that in advance instead of waiting for the crisis. Jack Healy, who's on our expert council, used to be CFO of a public company, and they were in the warehouse and distribution facility business, and they had a tornado that took out their key primary warehouse. That loss was staggering on them, but what would the insurance pay? How would they pay it? Would they pay if the company's employees did it or only if they brought in a third party? So understanding the risk, manage the policies and the limits and the deductibles and their ability to respond, and then so that you understand it, not waiting until there's a claim. Many of you are involved as professionals in the business continuity area within your organizations and are not necessarily dealing with the risk management side within your group that handles the purchase of insurance. This is a good opportunity for you to start to reach out and merge those with what you're doing so that the strategic aspects of your job come clear. Karen?
So, Jim, wrap us up in the strategery, as it were. How would you tie a ribbon around, we're covering a significant subject in 45 minutes today, and so the best advice you can give to people, this is right from you. Why don't you go ahead and wrap this slide up for us?
Okay, well, first of all, I didn't know if that was a George Bush lead-in joke or not, but it's, as we think about these things, no matter who it is and what they're doing, if you don't have this structure in place in advance and you're doing it on the fly, you're going to miss something. Thinking about each one of these, establishing who's going to be on your crisis management team, and documenting how decisions are going to be made become absolutely critical. A general can't operate unless they have intelligence. Where's the enemy? What's their force? What size and which direction are they moving? And in today's world, there's now open source intelligence that would tell you what's going on not only on traditional media, but on social media and understanding those events. Now, it certainly is good for us if we're dealing with a violent potential threat of being able to understand someone that's on a path to violence. But also, if you're understanding what's going on, you'll know the schools are closed or the banks are closed or that the highway's closed, like in Atlanta, and so you can better plan it. If you don't have an open source intelligence program within your organization, then you're flying blind. Imagine how it would be if you were trying to fly a jetliner and you couldn't tell where you were and where you were going and where everybody else is in the air. We would be dealing with a catastrophic event. So documenting what the steps are if these things happen, and then testing it to see that we can in fact make the decisions and those elements would come into place, both on how we're going to respond with decisions, how we're going to respond with actions, and then finally how we're going to respond with communications. Strongly encourage you to have the basis, home basis created of what you're going to talk about, and then here are the questions that you expect to be asked, and here are our answers, and do those in message maps. Tweaking those in an event makes it much easier, and now you've led us directly over into a crisis management maturity model. And if you look at those factors along the left-hand side, decision process, roles and responsibilities, information clarity, speed of decision-making, communications, effectiveness, those are absolutely critical. Does it come to you and your organization? Do you treat everything as a surprise, so it's a liability? Are you a little bit ahead of that, so you've got some of the basics there, but you're still in a reactive mode? Is it, though, more integrated, so it's supported? There are pre-action steps that are taken. And finally, is it part of your culture? Is it who we are as an organization? Every time you move from a stage 1 to a 2 to a 3 or a 4, those are significant breakthroughs in control and value associated within your organization. By the way, if you do a tabletop exercise, I would encourage you to take this approach and evaluate how did our team come together. I will share with you that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. If you find yourself in a surprise in a crisis, it's not good. Karen's just put up the link to the brief. Those should be up in the next day or so. So you'll be able to look back at this and share it with others, and this will be recorded today, so you can have others see this and view it later. Karen?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jim. I'd also like to encourage everyone on the call to visit firestorm.com, and on the front of the website under resources, there is a great paper we've just published that is an interview that Jim Satterfield did with his good friend and crisis management peer, Bruce Blythe. And it's a conversation between two crisis leaders, and it is a great read. I learned a lot from it. I'd also like to thank again the New Jersey Manufacturing Exchange Program. I look forward to speaking with you next month. And Joe, thank you for being on the call and for the great members that attend. Our thanks to you, and we look forward to speaking to you next month. This will end our call today. Thanks so much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Jim.